Today we are taking a closer look at one of the most interesting pieces of computer technology of this year. This is the M4 Mac Mini. And today we will be evaluating how well it suits photographers and filmmakers' needs. I'm David, you are watching DaVision, and let's go. The Mac Mini is essentially the mother of all mini PCs. And after 2023 passed without any upgrades, this generation not only introduces the new M4 processor, but also a long-awaited redesign of the case after 10 years. But more on that in a bit. The Mac Mini is Apple's best-selling computer, and that's for a good reason, because it's affordable. Most affordable Apple Mac so far. In recent generations, however, there was a big drawback. The most affordable Mac Mini only came with 8 gigs of RAM, which wasn't enough for many tasks. That's different now, as Apple's M4 Mac Mini starts with 16 gigs of RAM, and the price is still just 700 euros for the base version here in Europe. The main issue remains the cost of upgrades, since Apple still charges quite a bit for additional RAM and SSD upgrades. I opted for the M4 processor, 16 gigs of RAM and a 512 gig SSD. Even though that brings the price up to 930 euros. As the smallest SSD is reportedly significantly slower than the 512 gig option, I opted for this. But the performance of the 700 euros base model should be largely comparable to this one here. But you also get a really solid selection of ports for expansion now, so if you can live with the 256 gig, you can expand via USB 4 SSD enclosure. And now you can even upgrade the M4's RAM to 32 gigs, if you have the budget. 10 gig Ethernet is also still available for a moderate 115 euros extra, which you won't find in any other mini PC or in many other mini PCs. The M4 processor itself, while no longer brand new, it was introduced back in spring with the iPad Pro, it's still impressive. It's no longer an 8-core processor like the M2, but now a 10-core processor built on the latest 3nm process and is incredibly efficient. 4 performance CPU cores, 6 efficiency cores and 10 GPU cores from Apple's latest generation share a 35-watt power limit. It also includes a new and extremely powerful NPU, Neural Processing Unit, for AI tasks, like Apple Intelligence, which we in Europe get to try out next year, hopefully. The NPU is more powerful, 3 times more powerful, than the one in my most expensive M3 Max MacBook Pro. And if you need even more power, the Mac Mini now comes with the M4 Pro chip if you want. A 12 or 14 core processor with 16 or 20 GPU cores, providing about 60 to 100% more raw GPU power. You can also configure it up to 64 gigs of RAM and 8 terabytes of SSD storage, but that won't be cheap then. The design of the 2024 Mac Mini has clearly changed, but Apple has stayed true to its aesthetics. The Mac Mini is now significantly smaller, with about 7 cm less in side length, requiring much less desk space. That's really welcome. The height has increased to 5 cm, but the Mini is considerably lighter than the previous one. The corners are still heavily rounded, and Apple continues to use an integrated power supply. You might think USB-C power source would be sufficient for the Mini, and it likely may be, but that would compromise the power supply needs for all the expansion ports. Apple has completely eliminated USB-A, just like on the laptops. Instead, you get 5 USB-C ports. All 3 ports on the back are USB 4 or Thunderbolt 4 ports, which can be used for connecting accessories like fast SSD enclosures, Thunderbolt RAID systems, or 10 gig network adapters. The 2 ports on the front are standard USB-C ports with speeds up to 10 gig. It's nice to have them there because the old M2 Mac Mini didn't have any front-facing ports. What I miss here is an SD card reader like on the Mac Studio. That would be so cool, but maybe not enough space in the case. For video output, there's an HDMI port with 2.1 specs. That supports 8K 60Hz and 4K at 240Hz like I'm using here. And the Thunderbolt ports can also support DisplayPort 1.4, providing 3 display outputs at the same time. On the M4 Pro version of the Mini, these ports are even Thunderbolt 5, with triple the bandwidth of Thunderbolt 3 or 4, and now support for DisplayPort 2.1. The backside also includes the network port, which can be 10 gig if you desire, and on the front side you will find a 3.5mm headphone jack. which is somewhat annoying for me since there's no rear audio out for separate speakers. Front out is cool for headphones, but rear out is needed for speakers. The Mini does in fact have built-in speakers that aren't that bad. But if you want external speakers, you will need a USB DAC, and then that takes one of your ports away. If you are missing anything here, rather than USB-A ports, there's also no visible power button on the Mini. Apple, in its infinite wisdom, placed it on the bottom of the case. So to power on the Mac Mini, you have to lift it up. The power button on the back was already somewhat inconvenient, but now putting it underneath, what are they thinking in Apple's design department? Yes, Apple devices rarely need to be powered off and on again. My MacBook also just sleeps and wakes up as needed, but I still don't get it since a front power button is not that ugly. As for USB-A, I connected my mouse and keyboard dongle using USB-C adapter on the back. I don't want to use Bluetooth as I cannot unlock my Mac with a Bluetooth keyboard. And Logitech still doesn't offer USB-C dongles, but that's typical Apple. Maybe it pushed the industry into more USB-C, I don't know. Disappointingly, unlike in the iPhone, they've chosen Wi-Fi 6E instead of Wi-Fi 7 on the Minis. Although the Wi-Fi module has a 3x3 antenna setup, likely unique among other Mini PCs. And this should significantly boost real-world transfer speeds with compatible routers. We won't open it up this time as others have already done so, but it's worth noting that the SSD is no longer soldered, instead mounted on a swappable board, which may mean future SSD replacements or upgrades from repair providers are possible, like with the Mac Studio. The cooling system is semicircular, drawing air from the bottom front and venting it out to the bottom back. So the Mac Mini has no visible ventilation openings. As naturally for a Mac, macOS comes pre-installed. It's macOS Sequoia 15.1, the version that allows access to Apple Intelligence in the US. For us, not this year anymore. In everyday use, there's nothing that makes the M4 Mini struggle or hesitate. The 16 gigs of RAM is a luxury also for regular web surfing, as it allows more tabs to be kept in RAM, meaning a previously unused tab can be loaded from RAM instead of from the slower SSD, what makes surfing the web much more pleasant overall. But Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Chrome and other tasks are no challenge for such a modern hardware. So let's take a look at the benchmarks to see where the M4 Mac Mini stands. But first, remember to hit subscribe and the notification bell if you haven't already. That will help me really much. The single core performance for tasks primarily using one of the high frequency cores is astonishing, beating anything Intel and AMD currently have on the market. The 4.4 GHz maximum clock speed with efficient and fast RAM cores delivers an off-the-charts performance, making the jump from M2 in the last Mac Mini and even from Apple's M3 Max generation significant in single core performance, with a 20 to 30% improvement over 1 or 2 generations. That's something unheard of in x86 and Windows land. However, the M4 is only a 10-core CPU with 4 performance cores and no hyper-threading. Nevertheless, it managed to surpass AMD's Ryzen 9 370HX in Geekbench's multi-core test. Even that is a CPU with 12 cores and hyper-threading. When it comes to more demanding tasks, such as Cinebench R23 or Cinebench 2024, the M4 shows its limits. Still, it outperforms the M1 Max from 2021, and in the 2024 test it even beats Intel's Core Ultra 185H with 16 cores. In Blender's classroom scene, rendering on the CPU, the M4 is faster than the M1 Max and close to the M2 Max. But how does this performance translate to real-world use? Okay, Blender is also a real-world example if you do 3D modeling there. But in Photoshop, as measured with Puget Bench, the M4's excellent single-core performance hits a score of 10,400 points, surpassing my MacBook Pro with M3 Max, which has 4 times the RAM and 16 CPU cores. In my own Lightroom tests, the M4 shines at tasks like HDR merging. And only the M2 Max and M3 Max are faster when creating panoramas. Importing 261 megapixel RAW images with smart previews and one-to-one previews isn't that fast as on a CPU with much more cores, but doesn't take unreasonably long either. The only task that takes noticeably longer is HDR panorama stitching with 6 images, which scales with more RAM rather than faster RAM. And the 360-degree drone panorama with 2620 megapixel RAW image doesn't work on the M4 Mini, though it simply needs more RAM to be finished. The M4 performs impressively in regular image editing in Lightroom. It handles also large images with multiple adjustment masks effortlessly. Moving between images in preview mode, zooming in, mask edits, zooming out, again all smooth, seamless. I remember times when this was something that's so slow it drove me crazy. It's even more impressive when it comes to AI tasks computed on the GPU. For AI super resolution, that means upscaling to higher resolutions, the M4 Mini outperforms both the M3 Max and the M2 Max. While it's not faster at AI denoising, it's on par with less power efficient AMD CPUs in mini PCs. And with third-party software like Topaz AI Denoise, the M4 Mini denoises 50 RAW images in 3 minutes and 41 seconds. That's better than the M2 Max and almost as fast as the M3 Max. And it's light years ahead of anything AMD or Intel can offer in this regard. There's nothing better suited for photo editing in this price range than the M4 Mac Mini or similar devices with this CPU. The M4 is a killer CPU for photographers. The GPU performance, however, in benchmarks has improved by about 30% compared to the M2 Mac Mini and nearly 100% to the M1. It doesn't quite match the performance offered by AMD's Ryzen 9 370HX or Intel's Core Ultra 185H, but in practice you won't notice any difference thanks to the software's optimization for Apple's hardware. For example, in video editing, the Premiere Pro test from Puget Bench scores over 5,000 points, setting a different standard compared to what's a pretty good Zen 5 Windows mini PC. Although there are several that can handle video editing well also in the Windows world, but not this well as the M4 Mac Mini. And since these numbers are hard to grasp, let's show you DaVinci Resolve, which I know well since I use it for all of my editing. The most complex projects this year were the Madeira vlog series that I published on my German channel. This involves a 4K timeline with footage from DJI's Pocket 3, Air 3 drone, Action 4 action cam, Canon's R5C intraframe, Canon R6 II HEVC and Sony's intraframe codecs, along with numerous images, title banners, animations, grading, and yet the M4 Mac Mini managed to fly through this timeline. This wasn't possible on the M2 Mac Mini, where 8 gigs of RAM meant long waits from skipping timeline points. Here, the timeline performance is barely distinguishable from my M3 Max MacBook Pro. Exporting videos takes a bit longer in the end, yeah, especially for episode 4, where many clips required AI denoising, but it's amazing that it works so well overall. The time it takes to export doesn't matter as long as the editing experience doesn't become frustrating. And that's certainly not the case here. It's far away from frustrating anywhere. Even some things like stabilization in Resolve is ultra fast. Wherever it's 4K, 6K, 4K 60 or even 8K. The M4 handles stabilization faster in most cases than my M3 Max MacBook Pro. And looking at the export tests I regularly perform with various footage in Resolve, it's clear why. Apple's processors can decode almost any format thrown at them in hardware with their media engine. So neither CPU or GPU resources are needed to simply edit and playback the video. This makes everything faster than on a similarly priced or even significantly more expensive Windows mini PC, because they don't have this media engine. Today, you don't need an expensive PC or Mac for decent video editing. The 16 gigs of RAM might get tight at higher resolutions, yes. But even if you're filming above 4K, you still likely export in 4K. Editing 6K footage from a Panasonic S5 II, for example, poses no issue at all, and I can even view and edit 6K 60 FPS Canon RAW video with the M4 Mac Mini. For my workflow as a content creator with 8 to 10 videos a month, I can easily edit, export and make everything I do regularly with the M4 base Mac Mini. And that's something very impressive. If you are working with 3D modeling and rendering, the M4 also performs well among the high-end options. Thanks to the GPU optimization, the M4 is faster than the M3 Max in Blender's Party Tux scene and beats the M1 Max in the classroom scene rendered on the GPU, despite the latter having 3 times more GPU compute cores. Gaming on the Mac still lags a bit behind because there aren't many games with native Apple Silicon support and many of those are just casual games. Yes, there's crossover, but I want native games. However, I wanted to see how well the M4 GPU performs in gaming. Although Rise of the Tomb Raider is a bit dated, it remains demanding at high resolution. And in 1440p on very high settings, the M4 Mac Mini achieves better frame rates than the Beelink SER9, which I recently praised for its really good gaming performance for Windows Mini PC. For other games such as Baldur's Gate 3, Resident Evil 7 or Factorio, all run well on M4 Mac Mini with medium to high settings in Full HD to 1440p. If more games were available for macOS and Apple Silicon, the M4 Mac Mini could be a strong gaming mini PC with a clear advantage in terms of noise levels compared to other Windows Minis. Let's listen, or rather try to listen. It's incredibly hard to hear any fan noise from the M4 Mac Mini. Even with sustained CPU load in Cinebench for 5 minutes straight, it doesn't make a sound. The temperature rises to 95 or 98 degrees. Settles there, but the fan stays silent. Even during export of the Madeira vlog videos, you don't hear anything. My MacBook Pro, on the other hand, eventually gets loud when exporting a video in Resolve. Although it has twice as much CPU and 4 times as much GPU power. In everyday use, the M4 Mac Mini is practically silent. You have to put your ear right up next to it to hear a faint hum of the fan. The fan only becomes audible when I stress both CPU and GPU simultaneously, then pushing the CPU above 100%, and even then, it wasn't annoying. Hear yourself. And honestly, how often do you do that? And what's about power consumption? In idle, it consumes ridiculous 2 watts. Something devices used to use when turned off in standby. That's another 6 watts less than the best Windows Minis. In everyday use with Word, Chrome, 4K video playback, power consumption never exceeds 20 watts. Wow. Typically staying around 10 watts normally in normal use. And according to MX Power Gadget, the CPU draws a maximum of 22 to 25 watts at full load. Extremely efficient. In multi-core tasks like Cinebench, clock speeds hover just below 4 GHz, while the whole Mac Mini is drawing about 35 watts from the wall. That's about a third of what a modern Windows PC requires at the same tasks. The GPU itself is even more efficient, drawing about 10 to 15 watts when stressed alone, with a system consumption of 20 to 35 watts. And gaming consumes just around 25 to 35 watts, and the Beelink SER9 with the modern AMD Zen 5 processor with comparable gaming performance uses more than twice as much power. The peak power consumption is about 50 watts, when CPU or GPU are maxed out and stressed to 100%. Meaning they share the 35 watts power budget. And after a while, the CPU can only maintain 3.8, 3.7 GHz. But that's are all top values that are unimaginably for Windows system with x86 processors. So the Mac Mini is not only quite affordable, very powerful and fast, but also extremely quiet and extremely power efficient. In my opinion, it's the best deal for photographers by far. Get the M4, 16 GB of RAM and the smallest SSD. Then you can add on an external USB-feared SSD enclosure like the one I recently reviewed on my German channel, along with a 2 TB M.2 SSD. and you still be paying less than for Apple's next SSD upgrade. That 512GB SSD is faster, yes. And the 256GB SSD can get tight quickly if you install a few applications, a game or two, and since apps can unfortunately not be installed on external storage, that can be a bit of a bottleneck. But I wholeheartedly recommend the M4 Mac Mini. Apple makes it hard to recommend any Windows mini PC anymore, as there's no sensible reason to pay equal or even more money for less performance. Unless gaming is a priority to you, but then you are looking at other PCs, I guess. And with this new release, Apple has made Windows mini PCs less appealing. And on the other hand, more affordable high-performance PCs for photographers and filmmakers. I never thought I would say something like this about Apple, but if you need a really fast PC, especially for daily task uses, photo editing and some video cutting, buy the M4 Mac Mini. Intel and AMD have a lot of ground to make up to stay even in the conversation, and that's a bit painful to admit. You will find links to the M4 Mac Mini in the video description down below. If you buy through these links, you support the channel at no cost to you, allowing me to keep making videos like this one. And let me know what you think of the M4 Mac Mini. Could it be right for you? Leave a comment down below or join the Discord server, but it's mostly in German. And what I'm excited to see next is how the M4 Max performs in the MacBook Pro, which I will review soon. To avoid missing that, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell, and if you enjoyed this video, please hit a like. Here are 2 more videos you can watch next, since that's it for today, and I say see you next time.